Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. I'll keep this intro quick. I mean, look, they're always quick. They're always like just a couple minutes long, but what am I going to talk about? It seems like every week something's more bleak than it was last week. I don't know. My cat's not doing well. At the risk of this turning into a WTF. That's the thing. That's my problem, is that I never wanted this to be a WTF intro. Yet all the things that I talk about are what Marin talks about, which are cats, fascism, and anxiety. But anyway, Squee's okay. We're giving him subcutaneous fluids. He's a sub. We always question whether he was a dom or a sub. Turns out he's a sub. He gets subcutaneous fluids now because his kidney's not doing well. But you know what I do to distract myself from life? I listen to podcasts, and specifically this show. Yes, I listen to the show that I record with people because I enjoy it. And today's guest is wonderful. It's Selwyn Seyfu Hinds. And if you don't know who Selwyn is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from Georgetown, Guyana, writer and showrunner, Selwyn Seyfu Hinds and his family moved to Brooklyn in the 1980s when he was 14 years old. After graduating from Princeton, he began writing for the Village Voice. Then, in the late 1990s, he became a hip-hop critic and the editor-in-chief, and then editor-in-chief at The Source magazine. As a TV writer, Selwyn wrote for Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone reboot, and most recently created and show-ran the new Hulu show Washington Black, based on Essie Dugin's novel of the same name. And all episodes drop next Wednesday, folks. I'm excited for this. The only thing that is keeping me hanging on, keeping me sane in any measure is the relief I get from listening to podcasts, from watching television shows I enjoy. Washington Black looks really good, so I'm excited for that. And Selwyn's awesome. What a cool dude. A lot of surprising stuff. A lot of talking about going to Princeton or existing in Hollywood, which are schools or context where the elite ruling class point of view is kind of baked into the places. So I was curious about how Selwyn navigated those, as specifically as I, and I don't want to speak for Naomi, but I mean, she said enough about it on couples therapy. You know, we have our problems navigating these kinds of things, these structures, these social structures. So I was curious about that, and there's a lot of other surprising things. I won't spoil them. So I hope you enjoyed this episode because it was really fun talking to Selwyn. Coming up on the show, a lot of musicians, a lot of comics people. Mark Russell, wonderful comics writer, wrote X Factor, wrote a really amazing, I don't know what you would call it. I guess it's Elseworlds. It's a parallel Batman and a parallel Superman origin story that was illustrated by former guest Mike Allred. They were fantastic, and they were just, I read them, I gobbled them up, and so I was like, I gotta talk to Mark. Also, Rory Blank, one of my favorite online cartoonists. Musicians, Carson McCone, that was wonderful. Laura Balance, Superchunk, founder of Merge Records. What a good talk we had. So look forward to those. But for now, let's talk to Selwyn. I guess you formed as a person mostly in Guyana, right? Is that true?
I did. The superhero formation, petri dish, whatever you want to call it, of me is in Guyana back in the 70s. Oh my God, so old.
Or also, well, this is a question I have. How much did you change as a person moving to New York, moving to Brooklyn?
You know, moving, I'm not sure if it was so much me changing as a person. I think I think your core stays. I think you evolve, right? I think you go through an evolution just because you're being saturated by different stuff, by different shit. Um, and Brooklyn, when I moved to Brooklyn, was in a particularly kind of, you know, stimulating time, to put it lightly. This is 1985. The golden age of hip hop is in full swing. Um, the crack era is in full swing, right? And I moved to Flatbush, Brooklyn, which is kind of a home of both, in many ways, and vastly, vastly different from the childhood that I'd had growing up in Guyana.
Okay, so then was it a shock? Like, okay, let's first answer that, and then I want to go back to what was your childhood in Guyana?
Sure. No, don't get it twisted. Brooklyn was an incredible shock, in a myriad of ways, which we can probably talk about, forever, including like going to school for the first time, so Brooklyn High School, and like getting jumped in on the bus because like a bunch of guys wanted to steal. Like when you're a Guyanese kid, traditionally you get this gold kind of ID bracelet, that says your name on it. And as you get older, you kind of like grow it in size. So it's supposed to last your lifetime with you. Silly me, you shouldn't really wear that taking a public bus to school in Brooklyn. But I learned pretty fast. So that was a bit of a shock. Um, Also, like on a deeper sort of like level, I didn't realize how, and I won't blame this on Brooklyn. I would say more one of the pathologies about going to school in America, like how quote unquote smart kids are like looked at, right? In a way that involves both sort of like class and like race. Sort of going to school in America. I realized like, oh shit, like being the smart person is like a thing, right? It's like you're set aside. It's a whatever you want to call it. I probably didn't get the worst of it because I was also like an athlete, but it was very different from the Caribbean, where like being the smart person is what makes you cool. Right? It's sort of what makes you like you want to be smart, like you want to be like academically like driven or whatever, because you're sort of like at the spear point of society, I guess, if you will. So that was a big kind of mental adjustment for me.
Yeah, interesting. Have never lived in a place where being smart was an asset.
Very much so. I guess if it's one of the things the British gave us, is probably that. Alongside a lot of other bad shit.
Well, did you have also like the kind of, was it also the British schooling system type stuff where you get the like kind of, which is not great as far as I know, with the kind of like.
No, there are pluses and minuses, to that. I mean, when I went to school, we were still barely a decade out of the end of colonialism, right? So Guyana, the country, has its own project, was still sort of like a new thing. So the schooling system is very British, right? So it's so essentially you go to primary school, which is sort of kindergarten through what we call standard 4, right? But essentially 6 through 10 or 11, right? Then you go to secondary school, which is sort of like 11 through 17. So that's first form through fifth form. And then you can leave school at that point, essentially like at 16 plus, or you can take a test to go to upper school, and then now you're in lower sixth and upper sixth. And then those years then take you through the entirety of the American sort of high school system, and you leave at 18. So you're in school a lot, really regimented. Look, I mean, I would say like the wonderful thing was that the teaching was pretty advanced. When I came to school here in the U.S., for good or ill, I didn't really feel challenged until my last year of high school, right? Because I'm like, I've done all of this before, right? And the stuff that was new was like, American history and government and like sort of like that kind of thing, but sort of like your basic like math, English, science, so on and so forth. I'd already done it, so yeah. There is some advantage in that sense.
I remember my parents were furious in 10th grade. I think it was, there was no accelerated English class. There was this kind of like, it was, I forget what they called it exactly, but it was a history and English class together. And it was like 2 periods, but like the intellectual level was, let's say, one of the things that we were taught was Little Women, and my parents were so angry that that's not something you teach a 10th grader. That's like something you teach a 6th grader. It was my schooling was very variable. Sometimes I had really great teachers. It was all just dependent upon what the teacher felt like doing.
Right? Yeah. Different. Same here. But hey, I ended up going to public school in 3 very different systems here in the States. Started in Brooklyn, then went to Freeport, Long Island, and then finally finished up high school in Miami, Florida. So I had a bit of a tour all before going to college.
Okay. So I would assume Brooklyn was fairly liberal, and then you get to Long Island. I'm assuming we're getting a little more right wing, and then especially you get down to Florida, then it's just, I mean, what are you being taught? Like, the names, like the sounds animals make, and how to salute in the Nazi way. Like, what's going on in Florida?
Florida was its own outlier. Long Island wasn't so bad because it was Freeport. Freeport is in Nassau County and is part of a little cluster of towns, right? So it's like Freeport and Hempstead and Uniondale, and Freeport in the 80s was fascinating. That area, that's the town. I mean, that's the region from where like Public Enemy emerged. So
wait, sorry, Public Enemy came out of Nassau County.
Nassau County, yeah, Freeport and Roosevelt, Long Island. Yeah, I was right there. That happened. So that's as good an indicator as you might want, because so clearly you have both. Whatever the stimuli that makes a group like Public Enemy emerge, right? So it's not like paradise there, right? But you also got the conditions that let a group like Public Enemy, emerge, right? Nassau County was a bunch of, as we call ourselves, like immigrants from Brooklyn, sort of like looking for the suburban life and realizing that only really the houses changed, right? But sort of like drugs were still here. Institutional neglect was still here. Not the best schools were still here, right? Like the tax base might have been a little different, but, we had houses, but it still felt like you were still dealing with a lot of like the so-called, pathologies of urban America at that time.
So I actually want to ask first, before we get back to Guyana, why did your family move to the U.S. and then what prompted all those subsequent moves?
Yeah. Well, this is the classic, it might be a boring answer because it is the classic American story. But I think in today, it can't be stated enough. People come here looking for a better life for their children, right? And the Caribbean, sort of Guyana specifically where I'm from, but the Caribbean in general, was undergoing a real wave of migration in the late 70s and through the entire decade of the 80s. People would come to the US, they'd come to Canada, and they'd go to the UK. So those are actually the 3 places where my family went to. My mom had gone to grad school here. She went to business school at Columbia. And when she finished, we all essentially came here to sort of meet her, right? And even the interim moves sort of within the U.S. were all about the parents looking for, how they climb that social ladder, how they climb that ladder of opportunity, for us. So better house, better job, until they're like, all right, we don't have to move anymore. We've like found it, which kind of, as a kid, it kind of sucks. Like looking back, you're like, okay, that makes sense. But like, as a kid, you're like, Jesus Christ, how much am I going to move in my teenage years and have to continue to like make new friends, new associations, new ecosystem? But it works if you want to be a writer, right?
Sure. Well, this is interesting. Okay, so your mom went to Columbia, you went to Princeton.
Yeah.
I kind of see this a little bit. My wife, raised in Harlem, went to Dalton, went to Wesleyan then. And so I see a little bit of this, but I'm curious, how do you, as someone who sees kind of the way that elite whiteness has kind of like destroyed large parts of America, especially for people who are not white. Yeah. How do you and then you're in kind of contexts where, especially Hollywood too, where elite whiteness is kind of the dominant, let's say, habitus, right? How did you, especially as a kid and into your 20s, how did you navigate that? Did you I'll just ask. How did
Yeah,
you
no,
navigate
no,
that?
no. It's a great question. I mean, and it's a simple answer. I would say painfully, You know, very very painfully. I always like to tell people, as a matter of perspective for this, like going from high school to Princeton. It's like Lachlan Murdoch was in my class at Princeton, right? So that's you know.
Did so I now did you have a class with him? Did he deserve
Uh,
to be there, or was it just
I
well
didn't have,
he's
I just find it funny, like, sort of in retrospect, thinking about like when I went to school and who I went to school with,
mm,
and lots of like, there was this young lady on my hall whom I don't even remember if we ever met her, but we always joked about her. She was like Princess something of Greece, and I don't want to say the wrong name and like mess it up, but she was a princess of Greece, right? And but at the same time, right? You've also had a lot of people from very very different walks of life, for whom Princeton paid exorbitant costs for them to come, and lots of people from very 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 poor parts of the U.S., especially folks who looked like I did. So it was a bit of a clusterfuck in some ways, right? Because I think they've learned better now, but it isn't easy to sort of take people from vastly different places and just kind of drop you in the pot and say, well, fucking figure it out, right?
hmm.
Now, sure, there was a small cohort of, folks of color who, went to Andover, or, like went to boarding schools, who had some of the muscle memory for how you deal with the elite, as you say it. Where for a lot of us, I'm like, we're from public schools, and it's kind of like, whoa, this is different. you know,
Yeah, they operate by completely different rules. And
yeah,
I mean, I'm from like a middle class Pennsylvania city, and when I started to get into those circles, I was bewildered, and
yeah,
it really kind of fucked me up. I mean, still to this day.
yeah, yeah. But you go and you learn. I'd like to think the person I am today in Hollywood, which is its own, like you said, version of a mainstream driven elite space, is a little more evolved, even than a person who existed in New York media in the '90s, which is also its own very similar space, as well. So you kind of get your training in being like one of the few in the room, and sort of
Mm.
how that works. And hopefully that muscle memory then stays with you as you're just trying to be who you are and write the stories you want to write, and approach the world in a way that you think makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I ask it not to like poke at like trauma or anything like that, but
It's all good.
I'm curious when I ask these questions on the show. What I'm really curious about is how do your dreams and existential desires mutate, or do they,
Yeah,
as you enter these spaces, right?
yeah,
And if not, what is it about you that allowed you to hold on to those original dreams?
sure, sure. I mean, I would say specifically because Princeton was a real alchemist cauldron, like, for me, right? And I think because it's specifically because there were aspects of it that were so tough, right? And I don't mean academically. That's like over here. That's like in a way like the least important thing about college, right? Even though it's like the most, right? But it's all the other stuff. It's the social stuff. It's the becoming a human being. It's the, as you said, manifesting your inner desires into your existential route in life, right? It's all that shit. But because it was so hard to do any of that at Princeton, right? Um, in the act of fighting to define who you are, what you want, what you think you deserve in this, you begin to form, yourself, and to take it from sort of heady language to more specific. So when I went to Princeton, I wanted to be a doctor, right? And I wanted to be a doctor because that is one of the two or three choices that Caribbean boys are allowed to be, right? You're a doctor, a lawyer, sometimes an engineer, but it's very specific, like very programmatic, right? And now I'd always, and we'll get back to this in Ghana, I'd always been a writer. More importantly, I'd always been a reader, right? I'd always had this creative side. I'd always written poetry. I was always into music. At that time in my life, I was a dancer as well. I always had this sort of like wild, creative side. But there was no sort of structure attached to that said you can carve a life out of this, right? So I go to Princeton, and thank God, because I'm pretty sure my roommate suggested this because he's like, you should come sit in on, because the like prereqs for pre-med didn't really start till like sophomore year, and he's like, you should just come sit in on a couple of these classes, right? So I went to organic chemistry, which is like the main like prereq for pre-med, and walked out after 10 minutes. Was like, the fuck no, what am I it's like,
what, everything's carbon? No, I'm sick of this.
I was like, just kind of spiritually, and I think at that age, 18 going into 19, it was where you first start to separate your individual self, both from sort of family, parental pressure, and also whatever the institutional sort of pressure and dictates of schooling say, right? You sort of define, no. Like, what do I want? Not what do I think I need to do to make people happy, right? So for me, it meant like, okay, learn how to lean into your creative side. And I kind of did, that my freshman year at school was really where so much stuff started in terms of music, in terms of writing, in terms of my politics. I was a really, really radical kid. Yeah. We used to take over the president's office like habitually, to like demand whatever we were, demanding at that time.
Did it work?
Yeah. We actually, one of the things I'm most proud of is there was an office at Princeton at that time called Share. And it was a very tiny office that had one counselor, and it was for victims of sexual, assault, which, as you know, on college campuses is a thing, right? And it was just this one tiny office. And I think it was maybe I can't remember what semester it was, but that office was going to become a victim of budget cuts, right? So we launched this big campaign called SOS, Save Our Share, which I think got written up in the New York Times and certainly in the New Jersey papers at the time. But it consisted of, two groups of us as protesters, some who were in, the president at the time, Hal Shapiro's office, just occupying it. And the rest of us were sort of like outside, like holding vigil. I was in the outside group. And I think that lasted about a week. But anyway, we were successful, and the office, survived. So it was a good lesson for, for me too, in the sort of power of people, right? Mm-hmm. At a base level. So yeah, that was my freshman year. I was dancing on Club MTV, at the time.
Sorry, wait, what?
I know I said I was a dancer. You were like, yeah, what does that mean? No,
I thought it was like Alvin Ailey or something. I thought you were like, that's what you meant. Like,
no, I was back in my teens. I was sort of like a big hip hop like club dancing dude. You can still find me in some random like rap videos from like back in the day. But my biggest claim to fame was dancing on Club MTV, TV, which was like in those days like the thing. So my freshman year, I was doing that. I mean, I'm so glad my own daughter was a much better freshman year student than I was. I had a horrible year academically, surprise, surprise, but I had like the best year of life ever, right? Like I would leave Princeton, in the afternoon and go to New York and go to some club and be there till like 6 a.m. and stumble back to school and stumble into class. And, but I learned so much about myself, right? And I learned so much about what it is to exist outside of the strictures, right? And outside of the structures, and learn to sort of like turn down the myriad of voices that are like, you can do this or you can't do that, right? And this is like, I don't know where this path leads, but I'm going to just keep stumbling down it until I figure it out.
Can you actually walk me through that process? Because I had a similar process, but mine was elongated. It was very much like, well, without going into the whole story, but, same thing, sure. Same kind of thing. My parents wanted a doctor or a lawyer, right? And I took a philosophy class, an existentialism class, my first semester. And I was like, oh, no, that's the thing.
Yeah.
But again, with all the creative desires that I really wanted to do buried in such a way that I couldn't even acknowledge that that's what I wanted or knew that it was a job. So all of this like weird repressed or unconscious, I guess is probably a better way of saying it, mixture that eventually like a decade later I'm able to acknowledge. But it seems like you, well, maybe 10 years, but I'm saying yours is condensed into 1 year. And I'm curious if you could just walk me through the process.
I can. This is about to launch into another story because you're definitely going to be like, you did what? As I'm about to tell you. So kids don't necessarily try this at home. This is just what I did. So we're coming towards the end of that freshman year, where, as I said, I have danced, I have written. You know, I was in a poetry group. You know, like back then, like slam poetry was like, you know, like my thing, right? You know, so I was poetry. Was writing short fiction. I hadn't started writing about music and hip hop yet, which is the real sort of turn for me later. I was just writing sort of pure creativity at the time. We get to the end of my freshman year, and I have done, academically speaking, abysmally, right? Like no surprise. And again, you know, consider my background. Like, you know, my mom, my parents, you know, are the original like Tiger Mom, like parents, right? I don't think before I went to college that I ever got less than an A plus, not less than an A, less than an A plus, like ever, right? You know, so my grades were going to be a problem, right? And they were. So fast forward to me, I'm in Times Square, New York. This is summer 1990, like just after school ends, and I'm on a payphone, right? So yeah, flashback to different technology, and I'm having this huge fight with my mom, right? And my mom is lightning to me, right? And says, this is completely unacceptable. The other thing to know, too, is I think I said this earlier, is I was an athlete. So I'd also had a few offers to run track as well as to go to like Princeton and Yale and so on and so forth. But I wanted to, you know, kind of go to an academic school, not an athletic school. So my mom says, we have called some of those schools that wanted you to come, right, and give you a scholarship. This place will still accept you. This isn't a discussion. These are dictates. These are orders. What's going to happen is, you know, you're going to transfer and you're going to go to this school because you are not going to waste our time and our money and whatever. Like, you're not doing whatever it is you just did. Like, that is never happening again. And I say, in classic teenage wisdom, I'm 19. You can't tell me what to do anymore. And I hang the phone up and I turn around and there is a sign in Times Square that says, need money for college, enlist. And I go join the army.
Wait, what? First of all, the fact that you said to your mom, you can't tell me what to do anymore. That to me, that
and only the payphone made me brave enough. With another person. But yeah, I mean, specifically, I joined the reserves, and I walk in and I enlist, and it was a combination of things, right? It was a combination of like the emotion of the call, the realization that I needed to try to become a financially independent being as best I could, right? And that being in the service would afford me maybe some grants and loans and things individually that I wouldn't get otherwise. But there was also like a deep seated sense that I had really messed up, right? That I had disappointed them, that I had disappointed myself, and this was like punishment, right? You know, in a way. So I mean, look, not at the time. This is like years of sort of like thinking this through. So long story short, you know, I spend what would have been my sophomore year of college on active duty training. Again, really in retrospect, one of the best things I've ever done. You know, going to basic training. So later that summer, I'm in basic training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina, where it's like 110 degrees in the shade, right? I'm 19. I've just finished my first year at Princeton. I've just finished a year dancing on Club MTV. Like, I'm a weird fucking kid. And I'm in basic with dudes from Appalachia, Kentucky, like just stuff that I just never encountered, right? Places I'd read about, but they were alien to me, and I was alien to them. Um, until the day that we were not. We were bonded, And I often tell people, in some ways, I feel like that's the first time like I met America in some way, you know, like, because all these environments, yes, sure, they're all facets of America, but they're all cloistered in different ways, right? Certainly Princeton College, right? Certainly like the parts of Brooklyn that I lived in, at least in terms of race and class, so on and so forth. But like, this was like everybody. This is like, people from like, just all, just young men from all across the country. And I kind of loved it. I kind of loved it. So yeah, did basic at Fort Jackson. Did what they call AIT, Advanced Individual Training, at a place called Fort Story in Virginia. And yeah, eventually did come back, and went back to Princeton the next year. But that year off was incredible. Was incredible.
Yeah. Okay. So this is interesting now, because now you have a glimpse at also now imperial dynamics. You're now within this kind of military context that teaches. I think is very interesting. When you said America, you're getting all these kind of like ruling class type things in different ways, in the ways that you see the elite kind of structures up close at Princeton. You see them from a distance, but kind of structuring how you exist in the military. I guess one, how does that affect you? And two, how long was the commitment to the military?
Yeah. The military piece was pretty simple. It was a reserve hitch, so it's 6 years, I think.
Just 6 years.
But not an active, right? So I think so. I did a year active. I did 2 years or three, probably 2 years of what they call ready reserve, which is the classic thing that you always hear about: a week in a month, 2 weeks in the summer. And then the rest of my hitch was IRR, was sort of inactive reserve, meaning like if something happened, they could call me up, but I was just there, right? And
You lucked out, because I guess the whatever little Iraq war was right at the beginning, and so you wouldn't have gone to that. And then the rest of the 90s was quote unquote peaceful,
Yeah. No, we can't plan our timing, right? But yeah, got my beautiful honorable discharge in the mid '90s, I guess '95-ish. I got honorably discharged. So yeah, it's just sort of like weird pocket existence in my life, but for someone who's still relatively young, it feels like I've lived many lives, in a way. But it's had lasting impact, and I know you want to go back to like the stuff at the moment, but just in terms of just now, like looking back as where I am now in life, learned a ton about leadership, learned a ton about myself, learn a ton about, as I said, the different facets of this country, right? And yes, like the military certainly exists as this arm of imperial power, but it also exists as a very real tactile and tangible place where working class people, get together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the experience of being in the in the army, right? It's the enlisted NCO driven experience, right? It's not like, I'm sure they're fine people too, but it's not like hanging out with like, the full birds, generals and shit, right?
Right.
It's like the people who dictated my world were the NCOs, right? And that is its own very specific thing. Yeah. So just and I always say, like, in my writing today, I hop around in a lot of characters, a lot of POVs, a lot of perspectives, and I think a huge part of that is my time, in the service. But that in and of itself is of a larger piece of, again, I left Guyana at 14. I joined the army at 19. So all these moves that we've talked about is in the space of 5 years, right? All these various ecosystems from Brooklyn to Long Island to Miami to Princeton to the military at the time seemed long as hell, but it's a 5 year period, right? So, and it's right there during that very formative, period. So I am, I just have the anecdotal evidence, but I know that it affects me today in terms of my ability to feel comfortable, so to speak, in other people's skin when it comes to writing, So if I have to write a character that's John from West Virginia, I know a John from West Virginia. I know what it was like for him growing up, right? And I've talked to him for hours and hours, So I think that's only helped me in my career as a writer.
So I'm sure the endless debates in writer's room where someone goes, "Is this relatable?" You can be like, "It's not relatable," and then it's obviously not relatable. Whatever you're saying.
That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, you got some POV. You got some perspective.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting. So 14 to 19, that's a lot of change. I am very curious how much of what you're doing in this period is consciously motivated and how much of it is just you're reacting to what's happening. And you're just, because the turning around from the phone booth into a recruiting office, right? That seems kind of a like how much.
That was not. I had not thought about that. It was sort of like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. This makes, I guess to answer your question, probably we all want to be able to look back and sort of crown ourselves like the captain of our fate, like we stared the whole time. But half the time you're staring, you're being buffeted by the winds and the waves, right?
98% for me. Like it was all like, just like, what do my parents want? What will make them happy? What will make this person? I don't want this person to be mad at me. What do I do to make them not mad at me?
And I think that's the same thing I would say held true for me. The only thing I would add there for context is I think even as a child, I always had a high degree of intentionality, right? Meaning, again, in not so whatever terms, I've always been a dreamer, right? Always. Like, I've always been like, I see this thing that's over there. I want to manifest it. Don't quite know how, but no matter what the waves and the winds do, there's sort of a North Star that I'm always like aligned with and heading towards. So I would say like that's part of the thing that kept me sort of sane and whole, right? 14 to 19. Even if the star feels like it's like your vision is impeded by clouds, you're not quite sure how you get there, but you do have a sense of you're moving sort of closer, right? Even as what you think that star is changes, right? Because there was a point, between 14 and 18 where I thought that star meant like you're gonna be a doctor, right? You know what I mean? And it's like you get closer, you're like, oh no, it's saying something completely different, but it still is. It still is a marker for have a vision and desire for myself to be a person, a driven person, an accomplished person, and a kind person who like gives a shit about people and the circumstances of the world.
Right.
Like that seems like heady for like a teenager, but that always sort of was part of what, drove me.
Yeah. Now, is that something I want to ask a question about the creative stuff in a second, but since you brought it up, the idea of being a kind and compassionate person, does that develop? Is that a religious thing? Is that something you get from your parents? Is that something that, where does it come from?
Yeah. Not religious. As my grandma took me to church, but I don't think I've ever been like a religious, person. But from my grandma, a lot of it, who is, she's almost 100 years old, just an enormous reservoir of like goodness and kindness in my life. My parents were too, right? But there's something about a kid and like your grandparent that, especially early on, that just like cements, I don't know, Andy, I've always been again, not to like pat myself on the back about it, but I've always been kind of like a nice kid. I was always like, I never really had like a dick period, I think part of it too is probably being like an elder sibling, right? So I really got the responsibility, and it might be alien for kids today, but back then, like, you know what I mean? Like, the parents might disappear, and it's like, okay, I'm in charge of the house with my two younger brothers, and I'm 11, right? So I think I've always had a sense of communal responsibility that partly becomes that's because of that. And then I would just say, like, I think even as children, like, we start forming our life philosophy early. I think it changes, and I think it may evolve, and it gets like it's calluses and it scales. But I don't think you got to go too far in life before you're like, no, like that guy's like kind of be good. Like, this guy's a fucking dick. This guy's a bully. Like, like all those things are kind of like they kind of start early, and um, I guess I got on the good side.
Right, but you could have been a person, right, who goes along to get along, right? You could have been like, well, that guy's a dick, but he's also, I don't want to be bullied by him, so I'll kind of, mold myself into his image, or I'll be his little henchman or whatever, right? You could have seen, right?
Sure.
It's about,
Sure.
When I hear this kind of stuff, the question is like, well, why stay committed to being a decent human being when, especially in a world, I mean, you moved to America in Reagan's America when the evil is starting to win. And, she's like, why not be an evil person? They seem to get ahead.
Yeah. Man, yes, those are really good questions. It seems to make logical sense to me that a lot of this has to be your parents and your community. Um, in combination with who you are, but those things are also developing who you are. It's the things you see. Oh, also, I think as part of it too is the things you're ingesting, maybe as well, right? So for some people, that might be religion. For me, from as far back as I can remember, it was books. And it was specific kinds of books, right? Like, again, maybe this is part of being like the nerd kid. you know, I was that kid. I was the Tolkien reader. I was anything that was sort of adventure based and quest based and had a hero in it with a lance on a horse with a dragon on the others. And anything sort of that ilk got me, right. So I hadn't really articulated this to myself before, but it's not inconceivable that one of the things that's happening is from the stuff you're ingesting, you're also forming this image of yourself, and you're like, I would like to be like these people, right? Like, I would like to imagine that I can be as moral, as forthright, as wholesome, that I could stand on the side of right, that I could stand for the little guy, and in whatever ways you tell yourself that as a child. I think it has to be the case that you're ingesting so much content and culture at such a formative age that informs your opinions too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this is the other question I had about when you were talking just before about creative stuff. Were you aware that you had these dreams buried under the doctor thing? Or was it unconscious and you're just like, well, I have to be a doctor? And then, because I think the unconscious stuff, I know it, at least from my experience, was that it was unacknowledged. And so it started causing chaos because you have this kind of unconscious desire that's underneath this other stuff. And it's constantly bumping up in your brain.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what was it like for you?
I would say it was a combination. So it was conscious in the fact that I was always aware that I had an imagination and that I had an ability to articulate that imagination. And I think the earliest point where I remember sort of articulating it and being acknowledged for it and being like, oh, this kid got talent. I was 10 years old, and it was English classes in Guyana, and we're asked to, like, write a story or whatever. And I wrote this story about a fishing trawler that gets attacked by vampires at night in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And my teacher was so worried, she called my parents. And she was like, what is this child? What is he reading? What is he looking at? Like, what is going, because she also was like, this also doesn't sound like a kid. Little did she know, at 10, I'm also like, at least at that point, 2 years into reading like every Stephen King I could get like my hands on, like I said, my fantasy stuff was also broadened out into horror, brought out into thrillers. We also were pretty liberal at home with the TV. Now back then it wasn't sort of broadcast TV. We lived off of VHS and Betamax, right? So this is like the late 70s and early 80s. So we get all these like tapes from our relatives in the US, would send them down. And because my grandparents especially had a library of movies, these were just a set of movies that I just saw like constantly, right? So by the time I was 10, I must have seen Jaws 100 times. I must have seen Alien, a couple dozen times. You know what I mean? Like all this stuff that I would just, there weren't always things I was allowed to see, all right? But, kids will kid and you'll find a way. So, by the time I was 10, I had this like huge die-in that again is probably starts with like fantasy quest fiction with Tolkien. Also by that time includes comics. Like I distinctly remember getting my giant issue X-Men and starting to read like Chris Claremont like at 10, 11 years old.
Yep.
Includes movies, right? So this is all stuff that I'm just ingesting. And then finally it's like, let me try to write something. And then lo and behold, I can kind of write, and terrifies the adults around me. Uh, so conscious, yes, that this was a thing, right? But I was also, and I think this was also the mark of being like, a good kid, yada yada yada. Also very disciplined, very listened to my parents, da da da. So that sort of picture of my fate was like, that's what it's going to be, right? So whatever this other thing is that's happening, it's just gonna exist over here and kind of do its thing, and it did, right? Like my favorite class, even moving from Ghana coming to the US, like all through school, was always English, right? And my favorite part of English always was the time of the year where they would say, you guys get to write your own stories, right? Like I would live for that, it's like, oh my God. I really should one day go back or have my assistant go back and try to find like my high school English. And then, I think I wrote like my own riff on like Shogun at the time, except it was like a black salesman who gets like washed up in Japan and like meets a samurai. I've written like between 9 and 12th grade, I wrote so much stuff. That was whatever. So I was doing a lot of that. I was also pretty decent, like I was probably more serious in a structural way about poetry. Because I used to win like poetry like prizes like all the time. Like Princeton has like a major poetry prize that I won my junior year. Won a couple in high school. Poetry as a form really attracted me, which makes sense in some ways. The screenwriting today with its reliance on sort of like conjuring image to like brevity of language, it makes sense that I was a poet, right?
Yeah.
So all that was part of it. So at the point where I was like, yeah, that star I've been climbing towards, I want to do that. There was a thing here. There was a narrative. There was a whole backpack built of this stuff that I'd just been doing because I loved it. Like that's the only reason, right? I just loved it and it was in me. And it still made no sense as to like how this was going to replace that. And it took a long time because I think you can say correctly, even the first iteration of my career was not that backpacking full. It was aspects of it, right? Sort of like when something finally replaced the sort of medical thing, which turned out to be journalism, right? That just happened because it was like, hey, I have the tools of this thing so I can write, and I write in this particular kind of way, and I fucking love music and I love hip hop. And there's an opportunity, and it's sort of like, well, yeah, maybe I can put that, you know what I mean? So it wasn't like I was like, okay, no doctor, let me be a novelist, or let me, I then kind of stumbled into this journalism career that I don't know, took up to the next 15 years of my life, So, yeah, I've kind of finally found my way back home, I guess today you could say.
Well, that 15 years, Was it something? So, okay, in my, not to, again, I don't want to, I've told the story a million times, so I don't want to go too far into it, but just the amount you need to know is I was a philosophy professor. Again, this is me trying to, before what I really want to do was move to New York, do comedy, right? But I'm too scared to. I was getting a stipend in grad school, you know, and I didn't come from money. So I'm like, well, this is free money. I can't give this up. And I was teaching philosophy. I was studying philosophy. I was about to write a dissertation, all this stuff. It was, I'm glad that I had that period of my life, but in retrospect, it was not what I wanted to be doing. When you were writing for the Village Voice, when you were editor-in-chief of Source, right? Were you happy doing that? Like fully, like, oh, this is, if this happened to be the rest of my life, I'd be okay.
Yeah. Well, I want to do something different much later, but at the time, it was the most wonderful and exciting thing I could imagine. You know, like being 24 years old at the Source back then, there's just no words for it. You know, like barreling down some highway in the back of a van with Wu-Tang Clan, or you know, it's just, you know what I mean? Like these people were the superheroes of what life was for me culturally at that moment, right? You know, like I might have grown up like, you know, loving like the X-Men and the Avengers and da 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 da, and like they were kind of like right here now, right? Like it's sort of like these are the Avengers, right? Like these are the X-Men, like these are the larger than life characters that I am lucky enough to be in a time and place to report on, to talk about, and intellectually driven enough to want to articulate what it is about these people and this culture to the wider world, right? So that was like a massive enough sort of intellectual task that appealed to my, you know, also to my intellectual like vanity, right? That you know drove me. I also always had this sort of like the backpack here, right? You know, and that backpack was like, no, this all makes sense because now I'm working in Manhattan and I'm part of, yes, I'm in this sort of like hip hop subset, but I'm very much part of the sort of like New York Manhattan magazine world, right? And it is a thing in that world that someone like me will eventually write a novel, right? You know what I mean? You know, that someone like me who's an editor and a journalist will at some point broaden out into like now I'm writing fiction, right? You know, so for me it was like now the goals weren't sort of they weren't in conflict. It was just sort of like one would lead to the other.
Wait, how was that the path? Because you saying that, I thought, oh, you would write one of those, what were those like little pocket books about like Method Man or something? Like what it like.
Oh, no, it wasn't going to be that.
Like,
I was never
because I thought that's to me that's the pathway, right? You're writing, you know.
Right. No. I wanted to be that 10-year-old kid, man. You know, who was like reading Stephen King and Tolkien and like Chris Claremont. Like that's what I wanted to write. You know, and I knew. I guess I did it. Like I knew I had a couple and the part of my brain that was like rooted in this culture that I was talking about wanted to do a couple of nonfiction books, right? Which I did, right? You know, wanted to be able to write about music and write about culture. And eventually I always said, you know, it'll be my third or fourth book. Like I will write like the great American novel, like whatever that you know, that is. And it was a combination of things, right? It was literally like, oh, by the time my first book, Gunshots, came out, I'm not sure if it was sort of a contraction per se in the literary circles, because it wasn't long after like Zadie Smith's book had dropped, and you know, like there were a lot of interesting things happening in fiction at that time, and I just found myself like not driven enough to do it, right? And I know myself, and I know what it feels like to like da 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 da, and I didn't feel whatever it needs to, and I was like, something in me doesn't want to do this. And you know what I ended up doing? I mean, this is the same time frame. Again, I've never thought about it and connected. You're really good at this. I ended up saying, I want to just try something and see if I could do it. So I decided that I would write a feature script like I was adapting my own first book to see if I could do it. So I wrote a movie. I wrote a movie. I took my first book, Gunshots in My Cookup, which is sort of like half memoir, but half like biography about a Caribbean kid who sort of moves to center hip hop. And I was like, I took the personal parts of that book and imagined a movie and wrote it. And then I sent it to a couple of my friends who worked in the movie business, and I said, does this sound like I might know what I'm doing? And they were like, holy crap, like you wrote a movie. And that was it. And I was like, okay,
Uh-huh.
that's the North Star.
By the
Let
way,
me start
by the way,
how I can do it.
you're almost famous, set in 90s New York hip hop. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah, no,
if you haven't done that, I mean,
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I promise.
I mean, that's perfect.
It's coming. It's coming.
Okay, so we're right at the end. I just want to. I said this before, but I want to go back to Guyana because I'm curious. You know, what are your parents doing for a living when you're a kid? What's going on? What's your life like? You're the oldest child of how many? I know that's a lot of questions, but just
no. It's okay. It's okay. I am the eldest of three. My parents, it's my mom and my stepfather. My father at that time did not live in Guyana. He actually lived and still lives in California. They both worked in economics. So a complete departure from what I was into at the time. My mom eventually leaves to come to go to grad school here, in the States. Spent a lot of time with my grandparents. My grandfather was a businessman, and I would say maybe the most important element of all of that was my grandparents' house had this library, right? This incredible, library that was first rooted in the encyclopedia A through Z, which, like the good little nerd I am, I read like it was, I don't know, like it was Pulp Fiction. Like I read and reread those damn things so much time because they were so exciting and they were so transportive. And I particularly was a fan of the entries on the world wars. I have devoured World War II in the encyclopedias as a kid. All the campaigns, all the players, all the generals, all the politics of the moment. More than I care to count. In addition to the encyclopedias, there was also just a raft of all the English classics, right? Lewis Carroll, everything else that you might imagine. And then there was the books that my uncle, my mom's brother, and I think my aunts too. So my grandma also had like their books, which were arranged, everything from like the Hardy Boys to a lot of British stuff. There's a Oh my God, there's a series of books that were my catnip as a kid about this English pilot named Biggles. I don't know how much a U.S. audience knows it, but if you grew up in anywhere British in the 70s and 80s, you would know Biggles. Biggles flew a biplane during World War One, and he had a whole crew of mates. Bertie, Ginger, and Algie. Somebody British listening to this is going to be like, oh my God, in a second. But The Adventures of Biggles was my like transportive like catnip at the time. Also Tintin or Tantan, as was really, really huge in Ghana, back then. And then I started to add my own stuff, my own books. Like I said, Stephen King, Alistair MacLean, Desmond Bagley, Ian Fleming, the books, right?
Those are fun to read now.
I haven't even tried. I don't even know. Ludlum, was in there. Just all kinds of stuff, man. And so that was my little like workshop where I think Selwyn was probably like put together in so many ways. That library.
Yeah. Okay. So when does your mom go to Columbia? Like how?
Yeah, my mom goes to Columbia in 80, I think, or 81. Because we as a family come to New York in 85. So no, it must have been 82 because it's like a 3-year program. I think it was 82. So, and then once she graduates, we come to join her in 85.
Okay. When you say they're like into economics, like what school of economics? Like what are they? Because I'm only curious because, again, I think about Princeton. I think about the military. I think about all these things that can change you as a person into someone who is is empire minded, I guess. I don't know. And the economics is certainly a wing of that.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Maybe a piece of those choices that you might make, or that I make specifically, is to what degree can you incorporate the things of your parents' life, right? When you're clearly on a different path and going a different place, right? But there's something about working in banking, working in economics that has, as you said, structures of rigidity, structures of empire, structures of imperialism that there's an orderedness to them that perhaps as a kid you're seeking to dance within those boundaries to the degree that you can, right? So some of those places that you cite might be the closest I could ever come to whatever it is, right? Yeah. So my mom worked at a bank in Guyana before she went to Columbia, and she's retired now, but she had a great career in the last several decades at Bank of America, it's a I still can't exactly tell you what she did because I don't speak that language at all. But she worked in the bank.
Yeah, yeah.
and I write stories for my supper, so quite different.
When my dad was a businessman, I was just like, if someone asked me same thing, I'm just like, businessman? I don't know. He had a briefcase. That's about the best I can tell you. Like,
I hear that.
Okay, last question then, because you moved to New York, as you said, like golden age of hip hop. Like, was hip hop in Guyana? Like, did it make it down? Well, like, were you listening to Grandmaster Flash, or was it suddenly this kind of like shock of like, oh, what is this?
No, sure, there's a shock in the specificity, but it's not a shock overall. Hip hop really was that worldwide explosion. I think my first exposure to it was not too far from most people's exposure here. I was at my cousin's house and they were playing this video, and I kind of recognized the music because I knew like Chic, like Good Times, and I was like, I know that song, but what are they doing? Right? And this, I don't think this was much more than a year after, oh my God, how could I forget the name of the seminal, Sugar Hill Gang. Could have been more than a year, after it came out here. But that was my introduction, and that was young people's and Guyana introduction here, which was quickly followed by the breakdance wave, right? So so Beat Street when I was a kid was huge, right? And I was part of a breaking crew at my school in Guyana. We were all like pulling out the cardboard and spinning on different appendages and trying not to kill ourselves, like that all was part of growing up there, as well. And then that change in hip hop that is really precipitated by Run DMC, right? Like that's the sort of like change as we move from like the Flash era and the breakdance and then this and that, and you get to like the more lyrical era that Run DMC pushes. When I moved to the US is really where like I come at a perfect time to be like slammed with that, right? So I feel like I literally get off the plane to like Slick Rick and and Dougie Fresh doing Lottie Dottie, Salt Pepper, Showstoppers. I mean, it was amazing, man. It was one of the best times of my life.
Yeah. Yeah, no, because like when I was a kid, I'm a little younger than you, and when I was a kid, so the first, it's all MTV. So like my introduction was like Run DMC and Public Enemy, and I forget what else, but like that's the first thing to me. And because when you said it's a worldwide phenomenon, I was like, was it? I was like, when I was a kid, I was just like, it was on this one channel, and that. Yeah. Or the Beastie Boys, or the kids I hate at school are singing "You Got to Fight for Your Right to Party" on the bus, and I'm like, I guess I hate this band because I hate these people.
Right, it's hilarious.
So yeah, because I'm just curious, how much does it affect? Because since you wrote about hip hop for so long, how much did that affect your? Were you always? I don't know. I was like, oh, were you always going to, again, this desire that's kind of in you, there's this doctor, you're like more like this. How much of that does that affect your path, like, or your desires, or does it?
Yeah, it definitely does, right? It's part of the it's part of the like writer muscle memory that I have today, right? Sort of like that experience, in doing that. Even beyond the hip hop, being a journalist, being a magazine editor, I think is a huge part of my DNA. Being a TV showrunner, right? And sort of managing the multiplicity of things that one has to manage to come up with a creative product, right? I mean, I was editor of the source at 25, right? Which is a ridiculous age to be running a national magazine, but we were all kids, right? We were kind of like too young to be afraid of what we were doing. And at the time, the source was the top selling magazine on the newsstand. So like, it was a big deal, and I was a kid. Um, and those lessons are key, right? Like running creative, like it's not that much different than my job now. And creatively, I haven't unpacked it fully, but I do think it's huge because again, hip hop artists at the time really felt like characters, like they really were characters. Like they really were people that you were gonna delve into their identity and peel layers apart and try to understand what makes them tick. At least that's how I approach my feature writing as a magazine writer and how I had my writers do it as a magazine editor. And that approach is not too far off from what I do today, so all that musculature, I think, just got built up. And, again, I always go back to like, if you could write a Wu-Tang Clan story, you could write X-Men. If you can survive Wu-Tang, you can survive the studio system.
Thank you so much for joining me. This was an absolute delight. I hope you had a good time or some kind of on the.
No, I had a great time. I have not. You were right. This approach you do is amazing. None of this is like stuff I really thought about how to articulate before. So thank you so much for being so incisive. It's been such a great conversation.
Yeah, of course. By the way, you are probably one of the few showrunners who has any kind of managerial experience. So
it helps.
So yeah.
It helps. Andy, thank you, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks again.
Have a great one, brother.
You too.
All right.
You too. And we'll see you next time. Bye. Bye, oh, 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 bye.